Nigeria is at the forefront of a significant digital transformation, and the importance of safeguarding intellectual property cannot be overstated. Now, this begs the question, how essential is intellectual property protection in Nigeria at this time? Welcome to Tech Passion Special. I'm Ibukun Bankole. Today, we're discussing intellectual property and innovation in Nigeria. And we have Mr. Oluwatobiloba Moody, who is the director of World Intellectual Property Organization in Nigeria. Thank you for joining us today.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me here.
All right, so first off, what exactly is intellectual property?
Intellectual property refers broadly to creations of the mind, right? So when we talk about intellectual property, we're talking about a system that seeks to reward inventors, creators for their productions, their intellectual productions. I think the big idea around intellectual property is that we can incentivize more innovation and more creativity if people are given certain rights arising from those things that they create. It's recognizing the rights of authors on the one hand, but also on innovators on the other hand. I think that's in a nutshell what intellectual property is about.
Okay, so how does it affect Nigeria's ongoing digital transformation? We have content creators, pretty much an average Nigerian is a content creator. And a lot of people have started businesses, there are a lot of startups. How does this work for them, as you say, innovators and authors?
Yeah, so I think for innovators, authors, in line, and I think just to, again, second the point that you make, that we are experiencing a massive sense of online engagement, and there's a huge digital transformation going across the country, no doubt about it. And I think for such creators, intellectual property impacts them in so many ways. On the one hand, of course, I think there is a sense that with rights over the work you do, there's a sense that you own, like, the branding of what you do. There is you will hear some popular phrases or some names that are associated with different makers, and again, that's a form of intellectual property. But I think even more so, there is a sense that intellectual property is visible in most of what people are doing, and so there's brands that are being impacted on. There are streaming platforms that people are engaging with, again, that raise a lot of intellectual property rights and issues. And I think a lot of younger people who look into that space and see the rewards that are coming through. So it's also a question of how can we also cash in? And I think that also ties into what the intellectual property system offers.
Okay, so now, WIPO, how is WIPO helping to develop, robust IP frameworks for Nigeria, particularly because you said it's beyond just content creation in terms of maybe skits, it's music, it's pretty much across board. Yeah. So how exactly is WIPO helping to develop these robust IP frameworks?
Okay, so let me just say that generally intellectual property frameworks are what different national governments take on as their own priorities. And so WIPO as an institution is not necessarily tasked with developing frameworks, but we are more a multilateral international organization. And we work with governments, so we provide that kind of support on the ground. In Nigeria, for example, we have supported with the development of a national IP policy and strategy, which is aimed at bringing together, the systems that govern intellectual property and its regulations in the country. And I know we've gone through a validation exercise on that, and there are plans now to go through the validation of that document. But I think the idea is that WIPO brings to bear its experience working across its 190 plus member states to countries that request that kind of support, and that's something we've been doing with Nigeria. We also provide technical support in terms of legislative development, and so we had a recent Copyright Act that was passed. There's also the Plant Varieties Protection Act, again, that was recently passed. And there is a committee currently tasked with reviewing and updating laws. There is efforts to come to place with the Geographical Indications Bill. All this to say that we as an organization again provide support to the country on request, for these kind of legislative intervention.
You're working with the government to come up with these policies, and you have gotten to a certain point. What has the experience been so far?
Experience has been, it's been very, I would say, like, we've had so many aspects of it. There have been aspects of the engagement. Clearly, the government is keen to see how this kind of frameworks can be put in place. And I think you have a lot of engagement, but I think it's also a bit of a complex process because you're dealing with so many agencies, so many ministries, departments that have aspects of their work touching on intellectual property. And so to that extent, again, it requires a lot of massive engagement. Now, don't forget, it's not a top-down process necessarily. It's also a bottom-up engagement. And so you also have to be able to engage well with the stakeholders who will be impacted by such regulations. And so again, we've had to have focus groups, wide engagements, which the government has, we've worked together with the government to try and facilitate. And I think to this extent, I would say it's been a complex, but clearly one that has been yielding a lot of fruit.
So which is, that's really interesting. And this is why, now that you're working with the government and you've observed these, what is happening in the state government, maybe national level, and all, you've observed what's happening there, bringing it back to private sector. How would it impact the person that just started his business or someone who has been there for the past 10 years? How exactly would this policy that is being worked upon affect them? And what do they need to start doing, business owners need to start doing to ensure that they align?
Good question. I mean, so I wouldn't say the policy would necessarily have a direct impact on them. Remember, a policy, as it's been described or defined, is something that's going to set a strategic direction for the government in terms of how it wants to position itself with respect to intellectual property. We haven't had one before. And most countries, and Nigeria is actually taking that approach as well. You have like a 5-year document. It helps you to say, okay, over the next 5 years, what are some of the immediate term, short term, and long term goals we want to start putting in place, or we start working towards? Do we want to harmonize structures? Do we want to, what's our vision for intellectual property in Nigeria? And so that template is really what this validation exercise is about. To the business owners, I think what will start to happen, and I can talk about some of the more immediate term, is that an example is you want to have more education on intellectual property from an early stage in a Nigerian child. And so if a Nigerian is in secondary school, primary school, and is already engaged with intellectual property, I think over the next 5, 6, 7 years, it tells in society.
So the good thing is taking my mind to the point of how it will impact children. And if we start early, then, I mean, we can see the change that we desire in that regard. Now, still back to the private sector. You say the policy won't directly affect them. So, but how do they safeguard their intellectual property going forward from now?
And so maybe I should correct myself. This is probably where there will be impact from the policy on such business owners. There should be, for example, arising from the policy, a more concerted drive to things like awareness raising, to things that maybe like direct requirements, even for business owners around intellectual property. Things as simple as greater clarity in the administrative structures and systems around intellectual property is a big plus for them. When we talk to many business owners, the one question they say is, oh, but how do we access into, we understand the importance of this, but, going through the registration process is sometimes a bit complicated, or they don't know how to get to Abuja. There are different things. And I think when the policy document would then provide like a template on how the government wants to address a number of these concerns, I would say for businesses, intellectual property is such a key part of their journey. And one of the things that business owners need to do, even from an early stage, is to seek professional counsel. And I can't state it enough. If I leave something here in the interview, it's to say that, even what we do as an agency, we don't replace legal advice or legal counsel, but intellectual property is a tool at the end of the day. So it's like owning a piece of property. and understanding the best way to maximize revenue from that property. If I own a house today, I could do things with the house. I could decide I want to sell the house. I want to rent it out. I want to give maybe the top floor to someone, but keep the bottom floor for myself. And it's the same way with intellectual property. For a business owner, recognizing from an early stage that you're sitting on property, right? It makes you to see that the investment you place in registering and securing your rights over your property. And for a simple business, for example, something like your trademark, like your logo, something as simple as if you have an innovative process or product that you are marketing. The sad stories are when your business begins to grow and that intellectual property is acquired by someone else who is the first to register it. Then all you have is, oh, I wish I had known. So I think from that lens, for business owners, it's not even so much just about the policy, but it's really understanding that intellectual property is a critical tool that they have to be able to help them scale and build their business as they move.
Now, speaking of revenue generation,
Yeah.
how critical is IP to, attracting investment and fostering innovation in Nigeria and Africa?
That's a very good point. I think IP, for most investors, and I won't say all investors because it's at different stages people seek to engage with the business, but I think for most, especially big investors, one of the things that they look to is the intellectual property. Now, they of course want to understand this is a good investment, this is a bad investment. No matter how nice a product or process sounds, if you have a sense that acquiring this is going to, down the line, you'll be challenged for the title on this, it scares people off. But I think if you have from an early stage a process already where intellectual property rights have been secured, then what it does is it makes your product more investor worthy. And so we've seen again and again, even in pitch competitions, when people get to serious points in the discussion and they want to know, can we go forward with an investment? One question you will always hear is, do you have intellectual property? Have you registered your intellectual property? And if someone says yes, it boosts the confidence of any investor in that. The last thing I also say on this is when it comes to, this is even investing in the business, but even when it comes to acquiring, merging, all these kind of partnerships that you can structure around your intellectual property, it's a big incentive to an investor when they know that you have secured your intellectual property on it.
What are the IP-related challenges that Nigerians can, face, and even if it cuts across Africa as well?
It's a tricky topic, and and I think it's a good question because I think it forces us to imagine where the world will look, not just 5-10 years, but even the next 1-2 years, because AI definitely has the potential to disrupt the way that things, and I think this broadly around disruptive technologies, but the way that the world as we know it today is tomorrow. It also ties down into the way creativity and innovation as we know it today will be seen tomorrow. And the sense of who the author is. Now, the author has always been a person, right? And the author now, we're challenged with pictures of authors that are not real people. Is that going to be something that we see in the future? Again, I think from a continental and national perspective, I think one of the big things that we need to be doing, first, of course, is to be thinking. And I'm really glad to see that we have a number of ministers and ministries that are championing this cause around, AI models, but even just the future of AI in Nigeria. So key because no one has the answers, no one has the answers, but it's important for us to be able to sit down and think through what would this mean for us as a country. Importantly, I think one of the challenges I sense we will face is data management. And I think we still lag behind in terms of collating and managing large data. I mean, we lacking data sets on so many critical areas of our economy and society. And so when you think about a future that's AI plays a more prominent role, those who have learned to manage data are definitely always going to be in front frameworks, because I think right now they're not prepared to address concerns that would arise from AI's incursion into our society. And I think, again, that's something we need to be pushing ourselves. So maybe just one or two thoughts that I put there, but there are definitely a lot of things that we need to be thinking about in this area.
Yeah, very true. Because I know there was a time, this is more like a digression, that some musicians were, they were pretty much, how do they say it in the Gen Z term? They were dissing some, current musicians, saying, no, you're probably using AI to generate your lyrics, so you can't compare to those of us that were there before. So, I mean, there's already that, rancor, subtle rancor between those who have been there in the space, creating content, or authors and other creators who have been there before the advent of AI and other emerging technologies.
Right.
So, I mean, these are issues that we'll continue to face. Now, you said something about data, and that's where research comes in. There are so many studies that Africa lacks data, rich data. And so how can Nigerian universities, or the African educational system, begin to look into going into research on intellectual property, and which can, in some sense, also help with even the policy formation and the legal framework?
Okay, so good question. Universities are always going to be key, in terms of data management, harnessing of data. And I think you make a good point. Our research methods need to, they need to take into account how we manage complex data. And I think that the university system is definitely going to be one of our key allies in this sense. But I think with respect to intellectual property, we're seeing, of course, already a number of universities that are already teaching intellectual property. Now, remember that it's one thing to teach intellectual property and gain awareness on that. When you're talking about data management, though, you're going to be dealing with maybe like very specific departments within universities, which I believe in Nigeria, we already have strong institutions that have capacity in that area. And I think it's just a question of how to scale that across the country. Of course, it ties into the bigger societal challenges, maybe around power and some other things that really could impact on education. But I think, as far back as when I was in university, we had computer science taught, and we did have very strong data analytics even back then in university. But the question of intellectual property hadn't always been addressed. And I think now we're seeing a bigger trend of universities now teaching students across board about intellectual property, which I think only augurs well for the future, which is what we are pushing more for.
And that's a really great one, because that means the future is bright when we see this continue to scale up and expand, and then institutions imbibe and begin to practice this and ensure that they teach, as you have said. Now, in the coming years, what is WIPO thinking of doing as regards in expanding awareness and helping Nigerians and Africa to safeguard intellectual property and actually position themselves well?
Great. I think this is really why we're here right now. This is why we have a WIPO Nigeria office, for example. In terms of raising awareness, so the whole essence of the WIPO Nigeria office is to support the government's initiatives and push towards raising awareness and strengthening capacity of Nigerians to use IP as a tool for development. And I think that's something we've tried to push extensively with universities, with stakeholder groups, with young people. But I think to your question, in terms of where we see ourselves going, we've decided to prioritize three main groups within the medium strategic plan of the organization. We focused a lot on women, focused on young people, and on SMEs or businesses. And I think this is part of why it's so critical, the questions that you've been raising. We see ourselves over the next few years really using these groups, which I think in many ways haven't been we sometimes think about them as being underserved in many ways within the conversations around intellectual property. And the idea is that these are yet very critical groups in society when we think about awareness. A mother or a woman is obviously going to give knowledge to a whole community. Young people are the future, and over 90% of the enterprises we have are small and medium enterprises, even in the country. And so the bedrock of who we are as a society is lined in those groups. At least that's the way we've tried to analyze. And what we're trying to also do in the next short while is to do more projects, because we recognize that intellectual property sometimes can be quite technical. I mean, we talk about IP as creations of the mind, and someone looks at you and say, what do you mean by creations of the mind? We were once at an event and we talked about intellectual property, and someone came and asked, is it the same as landed property? And I said, no, but just saying that it's such a minefield in just being able to break intellectual property down. And we recognize that if people don't understand it, we will always be playing second. There are some people that believe intellectual property is just for the Western world. It's just for those rich nations. But what it is that they understand something, and we want to make sure that we also understand it, because we think and we believe that intellectual property can really transform our society. And so I'm not going to go too long on this, but I just really want to say that intellectual property is so critical for our development. And I think that's really what we're trying to, in terms of breaking it down, making it easier for people to understand. We think not just lectures and seminars, but we want to have more tangible projects that people can see what intellectual property did to this business or to this community. And those stories themselves become the resources that others connect to and are able to, take this intellectual property even more seriously. And so that's the approach we've taken. And I think over the next few years, you'll see more and more projects coming out like that from here.
Speaking of seeing tangible experiences that people can imbibe or business owners can imbibe, and now on the average, business owners are thinking of how to scale up, thinking of how to innovate.
Exactly.
So having that on their minds, will be like, why I have more priority compared to this.
Exactly.
What is your advice to a small business owner out there who is struggling and then now has to think of intellectual property? What's your advice to them to let them understand that this is very key in your business if you actually really want to scale up?
Yeah. I mean, I think we can't state it enough. I think what I would advise personally, I mean, first I'll recognize that yes, there are those challenges. People are trying to cover their overhead costs, and you're dealing with many challenges, and at the same time you're being asked to engage with intellectual property. But I think one of the things that would help is if you look at your business today and you ask yourself, where do I see my business in the next 5 years? Now that should inform some of the choices you make today. Now, if you see your business in the same shape and form in the next 5 years, it's probably not such a big deal, But I think most business owners that we talk to, they see themselves as part of a journey towards something bigger. They have a small business, but they see it as growing somewhere. They have products that they hope one day will sit on shelves in the US or in China. And when you start like that and you're dreaming that way, I believe so much that when the size of your dreams also, it informs the way you move. And so if you're working that way, then for you to get into these other countries, and you lose already if at that point when you're able to get there, you realize you don't have your intellectual property sorted. And so I think that my advice would be that the cost that it looks a bit much today to register your intellectual property, it's tiny compared to the gains that your business will have in a few years. And so I would often say WIPO has a number of free resources. We have an IP diagnostic tool, for example, that businesses can use. It gives you ideas on what kind of intellectual property you probably have or that you have available. It asks you questions. It's kind of interactive, and then it develops a report for you on your business, right? For the kind of advice to help you start registering. So I think it's important that small business owners take this intellectual property serious.
especially where they see that businesses could potentially scale up, which I pray for everyone it is.
Thank you very much for these very impactful nuggets that you have shared. And I'm hoping that a lot of SMEs, SME owners out there would begin to think along the lines of, intellectual property, like trademarking their business name and all of that. So if you are really intentional about your business, like Toby has said, if you're really intentional about it, you need to think back and ask yourself, where do I see my business in the next few years? Do I really want it to be a big business? And if you really do think that it's something that is changing Nigeria and Africa, then you should think along the lines of intellectual property. Thank you very much again, Mr. Oluwatobiloba Moody, Director of WIPO. Thank you for being our guest today and for highlighting the importance of intellectual property in Nigeria and Africa. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's all on Tech Pression Special today. My name is Ibukun Bankole. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube, Tech Pression TV, and follow us across our social media platforms, Tech Pression News. And make sure you stick around for another episode of Tech Pression Special. See you again.